Hello and welcome to Broad History, a podcast about the history you think you know with women in it this time. I'm your host, Isabelle Rogol. Today we're continuing our introduction to the women of the American Revolution with an episode on possibly the most famous love triangle in American history, certainly in the Revolutionary era. I am, of course, talking about the Schuyler sisters and their husband/brother-in-law, Alexander Hamilton. I don't think I need to introduce you to these people at this point. If you haven't seen the musical, What Planet Are You Living On? And it's actually while watching this musical in its very, very early days, I believe in 2016, at the Public Theater in New York, that my guest today met the Schuyler sisters and was inspired nearly instantly to write their biography. And inspired she was because Pride and Pleasure, the Schuyler sisters in an age of revolution, just earned Amanda Vaill the Pulitzer Prize for biography just a couple months ago. So I'm beyond honored that she would take the time to speak to us on Broad History. Before we get going, as always, a reminder that Broad History is entirely solo, research produced, hosted, edited by me, and it can only exist with your support. A big welcome and thank you to this week's new members, Camilla, Janet, Lynn, Linda, Rosemary, Amy, and Haley. Thank you so much. You too can get a shout out on the next episode and support this show by joining at broadhistory.com/membership. Members get early and ad-free access to every episode. Now, without further ado, let's meet the Schuyler sisters. Amanda Vaill, welcome to Broad History.
Well, thank you for having me, Isabel. I'm really, really excited to be here.
I am too. I had such a blast reading your book, and we're going to jump right in, just as you do in Pride and Pleasure. You start really in the middle of things with a beautiful scene, very haunting scene, which is the death of Alexander Hamilton, who is shot in a duel by Aaron Burr. I don't think that's spoilers at this point. People know this part.
I don't think so. That's the whole point.
There's a whole musical. I mean, people know that part of the story.
Right.
And so he's lying there on his deathbed with his friends, frenzied and emotional around him. And sort of on either side of him, you have really the two women of his life. You have his wife, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton, and you have her sister, Angelica Schuyler Church, who is Eliza's sister and Hamilton's God knows what.
Muse. We'll say muse. How's that?
Yeah. God does know, I think. But we'll get to that part. But it made me wonder, and it's not at all reproach, but it made me wonder, is it even possible to talk about these women specifically, and the women of their class and of their era, without ending up talking a lot about the men that they attach themselves to?
Well, I don't think the Bechdel test really works when you get back into patriarchal history, or it doesn't always work because, if it hadn't been for Hamilton, we might never have heard of Eliza or Angelica, or we might not have cared about them. Equally, as I try to show in the book, he might not have had the career he had if it hadn't been for them. But really, that's kind of what you're dealing with when you are dealing with history in a time when women were not empowered, didn't have agency, weren't rulers. I mean, Eleanor of Aquitaine, yeah, sure, you'd hear of her. Joan of Arc, you heard of her. But there were countless other women who lived lives in proximity to powerful men, and you didn't really hear of them unless their history came into the history of the men. And it's a kind of faute de mieux. I don't know what to do about it, but there it is.
That is the world they lived in and the societies they lived in. And I think it's actually interesting to look at their lives and how that relationship to the men who did hold the power that they didn't hold unfolded. And so that's what we're going to look at today. And I think we should start by introducing who they are and who they were before Hamilton, the Schuyler sisters. And as the song goes, we have Angelica, Eliza,
and Peggy.
Peggy, whom everyone forgets. And we're not going to talk about Peggy a lot today. And there's more.
And
which I didn't even know.
Well, I guess for reasons of dramatic economy, they just were sliced out. But in actual fact, in so many ways, it's really important to reinstate not just those two younger sisters, Cornelia and Catherine, but it's important to reinstate their three, count them surviving because there were dead boy babies, three surviving brothers, because what you're seeing, first of all, is the Schuyler family of progeny was substantial. And Catherine Schuyler, their mother, was basically having children, sometimes twins and triplets, none of whom survived, alas, for incredible periods of time.
This woman is constantly pregnant, right? She's pregnant while her daughters are having babies.
Yes. Her youngest child, Catherine, is the same. Her youngest child is younger than Angelica's oldest child.
Right.
And that gives you a picture of quite a number of things, including that the Schuyler parents had a very ardent marriage. They really did. Philip Schuyler adored his wife and was always saying, "Your mama looks more beautiful now than she looked when she was a girl," in letters to them when she's, in her 50s. And he just adored her. And she died in 1801, and I don't think he was never the same afterwards.
So let's talk about who they are, the Schuylers. Where do they come from? What's their story?
They are of Dutch extract. There was a substantial Dutch population in America, in the American colonies, particularly in New York State, but also in Pennsylvania, to a certain extent, New Jersey, all the kind of middle Atlantic states. They were settled by or colonized by the Dutch West India Company, who, once Henry Hudson had explored the New World, they saw this extraordinarily fecund area, just teeming with wildlife and native fruits and one thing and another. Henry Hudson wrote sort of rhapsodically about what they found there. And although he himself, this is in the 17th century, had hoped to use America as a means to find a passage to the Asian countries for spice trade, it's those who came after him who founded the West India Company who saw, no, it doesn't matter if this is not going to lead us to the Spice Islands. This is an incredible opportunity. And so they moved in large part in the Hudson Valley. And the Schuylers were the descendants of Dutch colonists who had been induced by the Dutch West India Company to come over and settle this area. And this was all part of a big global expansionist strategy. You've got the Dutch contending with the English for domination on the seas and in New England and in the middle Atlantic states. And indeed, by the time of our story, England had conquered, or at least they had won, decisive battles in their ongoing struggle with Holland. And they had been awarded the Dutch colonies in the New World. And so New Amsterdam became New York, and the Schuylers became British subjects. And they were actually rather enthusiastic British subjects, despite the fact that they held on to their Dutch traditions, spoke Dutch at home as well as English and French, which they also believed they needed for trading and whatnot. They were both farmers and traders. Philip Schuyler had vast land holdings in the Hudson Valley and on both sides of the Hudson, thousands and thousands of acres. And he farmed them. He had mills on them. He was a real pioneer of sort of entrepreneurial extractive economy. He made a gigantic fortune. He was a very, very rich man. And his wife came from an equally landed and wealthy Dutch Knickerbocker, they were called, the Knickerbocker families. She was a Van Rensselaer. The Van Rensselaers were, if anything, fancier than the Schuyler. They were a lot fancier than the Schuylers. They were the ones who were actually lords of the manor and had been granted a lordship from the King of England once the English had won domination here. So they were the descendants of what was really the most blue-blooded of New York people.
Right. As close to an aristocracy as North America really had.
And
right?
rich. And rich.
Very, and very rich and very land rich in particular, and very embedded in that New York, what now is New York State, Hudson Valley. Right. And so these two, Philip and Catherine, get a bit of a shotgun wedding. So Angelica is already in the picture. We're sort of about to come into the picture when they get married. Bit of tradition. Seems to be a very romantic family. A lot of elopements, a lot of not marrying who you're supposed to. Just a lot of
following your heart. A lot of that going on. And then, of course, what's so funny is that Philip and Catherine, up to a point, are quite disapproving when their daughters, especially, but also when their sons don't marry who they're supposed to marry. But it never lasts for long because they love their children so much.
Yeah. You can see why they're a family that is just perfectly suited for dramatic treatment and for novels and for theater. There's a lot of theatrics there. So their firstborn is Angelica. Then we have Eliza, and then we have Peggy. And those three are born very close together, right? So they're the three.
Almost a year apart. I mean, they're, in some cases, almost less than a year apart. So bang, 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 there's three. And then there was a sort of long wait. There was a miscarriage. There may have been more than that. We don't know all of them. And then there were a bunch of sons. They had John, and who was named after both the parents of both the Schuylers were named. The father was named John. So they were big on renaming family names. Yes. So the family tree is bristling with Johns and Philips and Catherines and Angelicas. And you can never keep them straight. It's just,
it's a thing they did, right? Same with the Adams. Everyone is Charles or Abigail or John.
Constantly. And you just, you almost want to give them numbers and superscripts and stuff. Then there was Philip II, Philip Jeremiah, as opposed to Philip John, who's his father. And then there was Rensselaer. And then there were the two daughters. There's Cornelia and there's Catherine. There was another little baby called Cortland, and he didn't live to be more than a child. And the two daughters Cornelia in particular also eloped. She was a very vain, pretty girl. Her younger sister married somebody that nobody was that fond of, but she did it kind of on the QT when everybody was in mourning for her mother. And it wasn't really an elopement. It was like, oh, they did this. Whoops. Well, I guess we'll just have to make the best of it.
I guess it's done.
So that's what happened there. But the family was divided into these kind of generational nodes. There were the three older sisters, there was the boys, and then there were the younger girls. And they seemed to kind of exist in classes in that way. The boys hung together, the older girls hung together, and the little girls were, tagged along. And also little Cortland when he was born. But and they were kind of more like add-ons. They were, in fact, the older sisters later on seemed to feel that they were like nieces almost. And they had them come to stay with them in New York City, come down from Albany so they could go to school, because education was very important in the Schuyler family. They really wanted those, not just the men, but the young ladies to learn more than needlework, but also to learn geography and handwriting and how to express yourself in a letter and how to speak properly and form sentences and history they even read. And I do not believe study classics, but they did read classics in translation. They spoke French. All the kids learned to speak French because it was really another language for them. Where they lived in Albany, there were a lot of French Canadians and there was a lot of French influence. So they spoke it.
It was sort of the language of the superpower of the time.
That too.
And classics, certainly they wouldn't have, because it was extremely improper right, at the time for a woman to know Latin. You often see this. Around the same time I studied this sort of aristocratic British family, and this woman who was very intelligent or part of these salons, she recounts in one of her letters being incredibly embarrassed because she had some visitors come to her house in London and they caught her while she was receiving a delivery of Homer, I believe, in Latin. And she was so embarrassed that these friends of her would know that she read the original Latin because that was so improper for a lady to
Wow,
do.
how wonderful.
Yeah, you also see Abigail Adams. No, I'll stop on that. But it always fascinates me because I was forced to learn Latin as a teenage girl. But I wouldn't have been in that generation. Abigail Adams teaches Latin to her daughter at one point, and
Yeah.
John Adams writes to her, maybe don't do that. She really shouldn't know Latin. Yeah, keep it for the boys. So there you go. But so this is how they grew up, right? They're quite intelligent, educated young ladies within the limits of what's acceptable in the era. Angelica, the eldest, is the first one to marry. Who does she marry, or who does she think she
Well,
marries?
I just want to preface all this also by
Yeah.
saying that there was a tradition in Dutch culture as opposed to in English culture where women were allowed to, even if they were married, to own property in their
Yeah.
own right, to do business. They could sign business contracts and all kinds of other stuff. And in fact, one of the Schuylers, the girls' aunts, was a notable businesswoman and someone who managed her husband's businesses for him. And I think this gave the girls in the family a sense of independence that they might not have had they been raised in a slightly different culture. But women were given a little bit more agency by the Dutch than they were in other colonial fiefdoms.
We see that a
Um,
lot in that era, right? Because the English Americans inherit the coverture laws, right, from
yep,
England,
yep,
which are
yep.
so strict, whereas, Spanish women, indigenous women, Dutch women, French women actually have a lot
Yeah.
more autonomy than English women.
This, I think, allowed them to feel a bit more independent. Also, of course, there's this vogue at the time in the late 18th century of sort of romantic elopement novels, plays. Sheridan writes a play about it. The Rivals is about an elopement. All these things are preying on these women. And so in the war, the Revolutionary War is broken out, and Philip Schuyler is the general that is in charge of the Northern Department, which is the whole northern frontier along Canada, northern New England. It is a very important theater in the war. And Albany is both full of, to the extent that it's full of anything, it's full of young officers. But really, men have gone away to fight, and Albany is not the center of the universe at the moment. And I think Angelica was probably feeling like she was hungry for romantic attention. And into her life came a man who had been sent by the Continental Congress to audit the books of her general father to make sure he was not giving way to fraud, waste, and abuse. He was kind of sent by the Continental Congress's version of Elon Musk. I like to say.
Oh
And
my
the
god.
Doge
I'm never
guys.
gonna forget the
No,
revolutionary
the
Doge.
Doge guys. There are Doge guys in the Continental Congress, and they send this guy who they don't know. He's come to America under what they don't know is an assumed name. He is a Although they don't know this, he's an undischarged bankrupt. He's fled prosecution for bankruptcy and left his debts and come to America, adopted a new name, and somehow wormed his way into the confidence of various money-making people and money laundering, I don't know, people who are in charge of money. And they think it's appropriate to send him to audit Schuyler's books, which is actually just richly ironic if you think about it. But anyway, he arrives in Albany and he sees this girl, the eldest daughter of this very wealthy man whose accounts he's looking into. And he knows that if he makes off with her, he might stand to get a piece of the pie because,
Mm.
again, under Dutch law, there was no entail. So Angelica would have an equal chance at all of the inheritance of her father. with her brothers and her other sisters. It was not one of those kind of winner-take-all situations that you get
Yeah, eldest son.
in English inheritance law. So he romances her. Schuyler refuses him permission to pay addresses to his daughter because, as he says, I know nothing of this man or of his connections, and the match is extremely disagreeable to me, he says. Whereupon Angelica, who's one smart girl, figures out how to persuade her younger cousin, who is then the patroon or the lord of the manor of Albany and the area around it. She persuades him to get his stepfather, who is a Dutch Reformed priest, to marry the two of them on the down low. And he does. And then they just, confront the Schuylers with this fait accompli, and there's a huge scene, and people are threatening with this inheritance, and I won't speak to you again, and blah, blah, blah. It's like something out of soap opera. Then, of course, Schuyler just loses, the steam goes out of the machine. He can't be mad at his children for more than probably 10 days. And then he just, okay, come on, all is forgiven. And that's the way it is.
It's a very loving dad. I do literally have in my notes that I'm looking at right now, what a soap opera exclamation point.
It really was.
It really is.
And the fact is that he was right. Schuyler was right to be suspicious of this guy because he's a really untrustworthy person. He's a gambler. He makes a huge amount of money very quickly during the war as a war profiteer, selling things, goods and services to the Continental and the French armies. But after the war, with his gigantic fortune, he's unable to sustain over a long period of time that kind of run of luck. And he just gambles away and gets bankrupted a second time late in the book. But he's not a savory character.
And she doesn't know any of this until is it years down the line? Like
this
or
is
months
horrifying to me. I could not believe it. She marries him, and she thinks his name is John Carter, which is the name that he says he has. But then, when he's made all this giant amount of money during the Revolution, he goes to France with his family, his young family, to get the French government to pay up before they don't have any money again, which is really smart of him, let me say. And he shows up in France and gets this huge fortune in gold louis, who knows what. And with this, he's then able to go to England secretly and discharge all of his debts, tell his family and friends, all of whom thought he was dead because he just disappeared without a trace. No, I'm still alive. And not only that, I'm really, really rich. And he comes back and says to his wife in Paris, hello, I'm really rich, and my name is not Carter, it's Church.
It's got like Count of Monte Cristo vibes. I mean, and you write it really well too, because when I was reading you, I see Angelica and Mary Carter, and I was like, I could have sworn her name was Church. I wasn't super familiar, but I've seen the musical. I was like, could have sworn, maybe she had a first husband I didn't know about. I guess at some point this guy dies. No. Same man, two names.
And all of these people were like John Jay writing them. Well, I guess his name is now Church, so we'll all just pretend that. Okay.
Yeah. She doesn't seem to be very mad at him. I would be. I mean, I guess the money's nice.
We don't know what went on behind closed doors. And up to a point, the thing that's interesting to me about Angelica, which I discovered as I went along, is that she is someone who she's pragmatic is probably putting it mildly. She plays things, and as long as the results please her, she'll go along with it, whatever it might be. But when they don't please her, she's not so happy. But she's really willing to overlook. I think at one point I said she's not one to maintain a grudge when it can be forgotten to her advantage. And that's really what
That's very sharp. That's very sharp. I have to say, I went into the book thinking like, oh, Angelica's my favorite, because I like a woman with a bit of spice. And then, I was like, what? Some things she does, I don't think I can abide. But anyway, but we'll get to that. So second sister is Eliza. And of course, Eliza is the one that meets Hamilton, which, by the way, the musical makes it sound like Angelica introduced Eliza, stepped aside grandly. No, she didn't meet him pretty much until the wedding, right? So
No.
Eliza's the one who meets Hamilton. How do they meet?
Well, she again, Albany is, I guess, kind of a ghost town at this point. So the way the sisters in Pride and Prejudice want to go to Brighton, or any place where there's officers, she arranges to go to um, Morristown in New Jersey, where the Continental Army is in winter camp, and there are lots and lots of cute officers for her to dance with. And her father is thrilled because this is a way for her to open a sort of back channel to Washington, his boss, and whatnot. So this is all good. And she's down there. Her uncle, who's married to her father's sister, her uncle is the chief surgeon in charge of the war effort in all the armies. So he's the doctor, and she stays with him and her aunt and goes to a ball at the storehouse in Morristown that they've converted into a ballroom. And it's kind of a coup de foudre. She meets this guy and blammo, within a month. And here is this man. He has no money. He has no family. All the things that were maybe suspected of being wrong with Carter are certainly wrong with him. Not only that, but he is known to be illegitimate, and he comes from St. Croix. I mean, he was actually born on Nevis, but he comes from the West Indies. He is a real rank outsider, but he's on Washington's staff. Washington thinks the world of him. And he is a man of very polished address. And when you read his love letters to Eliza, you completely, how could you possibly withstand this? He falls in love with her. There are those who think he fell in love as much with her position and her connections and her money as with her, maybe more so. But there are also others who say, well, no, actually, because Hamilton was so well positioned with Washington, who loved him like a son. He's a very important card for the Schuylers to possess as a family member. For whatever reason, Eliza is able to mollify any doubts that her father had about Hamilton. And a month after they meet, they are engaged. I mean,
and he really charms the family, right? He's working on the sisters. He's working on the mom, on the dad.
Yeah.
Like, he is clever.
He is quite, yeah, he really is. He's one of these incorrigible flirts. We've all known them. He just can't not flirt. And I think part of it is he wants to charm. He really, really wants to charm. There's a neediness about him that is kind of his Achilles heel. He just needs to be adored. And he is also good at manipulating things so that he will be. But he also seems truly to have been in love with Eliza. I mean, he writes her letters that are just, you can't, love is a kind of madness, and the proof that you feel it also is proof of your madness also. I mean,
This was a time when people could write. People could write, and they did. And without wanting to be his therapist from 250 years away, I think it's also really powerful that he's this orphan boy, right? And he joins this huge, loving, rambunctious family where everyone loves and fights and is in each other's life. Like, they won't leave each other alone.
Yes.
That must be really something for this orphan.
And Philip Schuyler, I think, liked him better than he did any of his own sons. He starts writing some of his letters to Hamilton. My dear son, he will write him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was devastated when Hamilton died. I mean, it was as much as, maybe more demonstrably so, than he was when his own son died. It's just
Yeah,
really
yeah.
amazing. Because his son John, his eldest, dies in 1780, whatever it was, and he was upset about it, but he's not like he is about Hamilton. It's
Yeah, you
fascinating.
can tell. I mean, we're jumping forward, but you can tell that Hamilton is like a piece of the puzzle that just brings all
Yeah.
these people, it's kind of the sun in the room.
Yep.
When he dies, it really transforms a lot of the dynamics, which we'll get to in a bit. But let's talk about him and Angelica. So he meets Angelica pretty much at a rehearsal dinner, right? Or like around like
We don't know.
we don't know
And I
exactly.
have a little set piece in which I say, if we were history painters, this is the scene we would paint. So I'm telling people, this is, we don't know exactly who was there or what happened. We know some of who was there. We can deduce who was there. We don't know that Angelica was there, but it would have been possible for her to have been. And it would have been unlikely for her to have not been, since this was a big family occasion. And indeed was the only wedding of any of these children, any of the daughters, that was celebrated from home. It's the only one. All the others, everybody either eloped or they got married. So this
Poor
was a big deal.
Catherine, like deprived. That's the one thing you don't do to a mom, right? It's
I
deprive them
know,
of
and
their
the
kid's
saddest
wedding
thing is
day.
the marriage that she really probably was happiest about, which is when Peggy eloped with Stephen Van Rensselaer,
Proper Dutch boy.
8 years younger than she was, but hey, he was the proper Dutch boy. He was the rich Dutch boy. He was everything that a Knickerbocker mother could want. Handsome, wealthy, well-educated, apparently devoted to her daughter. But alas, she didn't get to celebrate that. I think it's tragic. Anyway, but we don't know that they met then, but they certainly didn't meet before then.
Mm.
And the earliest they could have met was then. The next we see of them, Hamilton has gone to Newport, Rhode Island, where Angelica is living with her husband, who is acting as a supplier for all the French armies and navy ships that were part of Rochambeau's expeditionary force in America. And they were stationed in Newport. And Hamilton goes there with Washington to negotiate with Rochambeau about how they're going to proceed in their strategic plans to counter the British. And he stays with the Churches. So I'm I'm pretty sure they must have met before then. And the only way they could have would have been if they'd been at the wedding. That's the only time. So that makes sense. And
Mm.
she certainly didn't meet him before. And what is interesting is, of course, that it's pretty evident as soon as you see letters between them, sparks have flown. And I just wonder, Angelica, she's been so used to always getting her own way. She's the one that whenever somebody meets both the girls, they think Eliza's lovely and great. What a great pal she is, but the really glamorous one is Angelica. She's the one they all want to dance with. They want to date her. They'll be friends with Eliza, but they want to date Angelica. And I just think for Angelica to meet this guy that her little sister has enthralled and realize what a prize he is in her scheme of things, because he's romantic, he's brilliant, he's clearly destined for great things. He's ambitious, just as she is. It must have just been a really, a- she, she had to have felt a certain amount of asperity about, how did my little sister get this guy? How did I pick the one I picked who's okay and he's making a lot of money, but he's not that great?
Yeah, you can absolutely imagine the alternative history if Angelica hadn't married,
Yeah.
met Carter, like which sister he might have actually ended up choosing, you don't rewrite history, right? And it is one of the great love triangles of history, really. We're going to take a quick break and we will be talking more about this incredible triangle. We'll be right back. And we're back with Amanda Vaill. We were just talking about this love triangle of Eliza, Angelica, and Hamilton. There is maybe another love triangle, which is that Angelica, who is decidedly quite the charmer, ends up at the center of one of the big rivalries of the American Revolution because she has a bit of a flirtation with Thomas Jefferson as well.
Yes, she did.
So what's the beef between these two? I mean, I guess there's an opportunity to talk about Federalists and Republicans and sort of different intellectual currents, as well as the personal animosity, perhaps, between Jefferson and Hamilton.
Well, nobody talks about it as a possible motivator, at least not that I had discovered. And when I was writing, I discovered that Angelica had begun a relationship. It was a flirtation with Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson clearly was looking for as much as he could get out of the relationship. Let's put it that way. The thing that I discovered, I mean, Jefferson turned out to be so much a different person than I had anticipated. I used to revere him as this wonderful intellect, which he is. His time in Paris, this lonely widower over there, so sad, but just being friends with all these French, Salonese who he liked. But the fact is that he was looking for any kind of female companionship he could find, and he was having some kind of relationship with Angelica's best friend, Maria Causeway, the miniaturist, and she was going back and forth from Paris to London, where she lived. And she was married, and it looked like this was the way he liked it. There was no possible commitment that he was going to have to make. And then he meets Angelica, and he kind of drops Maria like a hot potato, which miraculously their friendship survived, Maria's and Angelica's. But then Jefferson fatally wounded Angelica's sense of, I think, herself and what she was looking for in a romantic partner when she sent him a copy of the Federalist, which Alexander Hamilton had edited and instigated and written most of. And he wrote back to her that the tender breasts of ladies were not formed for political convulsion, he told her. And so she should just not trouble herself thinking about these matters.
Well, excuse us?
Yeah, excuse me. And then he had the gumption after that when he found out that she was going to go to America for George Washington's inauguration. He said, well, why don't we go together? We can share a cabin on the trip. And I know, what? And what was so interesting is she just let that one drop. She wrote a little note saying, I'm just actually, my travel plans have changed. I'm leaving earlier. And she didn't say a thing to him because, of course, she didn't want to offend. But you can see right away, she's just like, that's not on.
Yeah, she drops him quick.
So then Hamilton, who has not met Jefferson before this, meets him when Jefferson is being made Secretary of State, and he is Secretary of Treasury. And this is 1789. And they're in New York. And actually 1790, because Jefferson doesn't come back to assume the mantle until then. And from the first, there is a frost between these two guys. And you could put it down to all kinds of things. There's Jefferson the patrician and Hamilton the upstart. Both of them used to being the smartest guy in the room, and there's not room for two of the smartest guys in one room. So there was going to be some rivalry there. Jefferson is tall, Hamilton is short. I don't know. But you sense there's some discussion of Angelica, and you could kind of see maybe this is a small bone of contention between the two of them as well. Hamilton wonders how much Jefferson has gotten into, and Jefferson wonders how much Hamilton has been able to entrance Angelica. And so there's already, I mean, leaving aside the fact that they have very different ideas about government and the way government should work, there's already a sense of rivalry between the two of them. And it just gets worse.
Yeah. I mean, we all wonder. I mean, you're taking my brain in 4 different directions. So I'm going to try to make these organized. First off, we all wonder what's going on exactly with Angelica and Hamilton. And you hint that there was an affair, essentially. I don't know if you say it. Well, tell me.
What's so interesting? People say I hit it, and I want to say, I'm just putting the stuff there. You're the one who's taking it.
We're drawing the conclusion.
You're drawing the conclusion. I'm not doing that.
Who knows? And in the end, does it even matter? But the way that she writes to her sister, I'm sorry, this is where my love for Angelica was challenged. When she writes, you essentially lend him to me for a little while.
I love your husband very much. And if you were as generous as the old Romans, you would lend him to me for a little while. And she's always doing things like saying, oh, no, the China you chose, you shouldn't, no. Hamilton likes the beautiful in every way, and I don't think it's something he's going to like. I'm thinking, excuse me, it's my house, my China, and my husband.
It's literally having a sister wife. It's a bit much. You talked about the Federalist. So I want to talk about, and obviously, so that's the great sort of series of essays that are incredibly influential to the revolution, and there were others before. What are both Eliza's and Angelica's contribution to the intellectual and the political lives of the revolution and of Hamilton's?
Well, I think for years, people did not think that Eliza contributed anything intellectually to Hamilton, that he was this flame that burned all by itself, and she kind of helped him burn, but didn't contribute anything to it. Whereas Angelica, because she hobnobbed with men and wrote about it and wrote letters to them, there's a few letters that she writes where she has actual kind of political feelings, although not quite honestly as many as I think people have thought she did. But she wanted to be in and among those who were making decisions about government and politics. She liked to be in the room where it happens. She really did. And in that sense, I think she could be influential. The most influential she was when the Marquis de Lafayette, the former Marquis de Lafayette, was in prison during the French Revolution. And she actually fomented a plot to spring him from prison. She was the agent runner on it. The guy who was going to do the actual job is writing her coded letters explaining how he's proceeding and what the plans are. And she's transmitting those to the people who were running, the political people that she has to talk to, including the American government minister in London, then Thomas Pinckney. But unfortunately, that effort led to not in kind of one of the sadder and funnier episodes in the book, to me, is what happens to that. But Eliza, so far from being just this little helpmate, in bringing Hamilton his coffee to fuel his late night writing sessions or his slippers to make us feel better or whatever, I've discovered, to my surprise, that she really was much more a part of what was going on than I had any idea. She was clearly his secretary his assistant, his amanuensis, when he was writing sort of an early precursor to the Federalist, which is his continentalist essays, which he wrote when they were newly married. He had just left Washington's staff and they were living alone in this little cottage across the river in DePuyster's Point, across the river from Washington's headquarters. And he did not have a secretary. They had help, domestic help, but they only had her. And she took down what he wrote, and she was a terrible speller.
I love that
And
you spot her influence by the spelling mistake. It's like, this is misspelled, it's her.
her fingerprints almost literally are all over these things, because the printer, in a haste to rush them into print, didn't even correct them. And you look at and you think, what the hell is this? And then you think, oh, wait. Oh, Eliza. It's because it's exactly the kind of spelling mistake that she makes. And in all of her letters that we have. And you see this, you think, oh, I get it. So then another thing that really was fascinating to me was that when Hamilton was drafting his memorandum in favor of the founding of the Bank of the United States, which was one of his signature achievements as Washington's Treasury Secretary, and essentially put the foundations under the nascent U.S. economy, he had to do and did a lot of research about previous republics, how they had funded themselves, blah, 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 blah. There was in the family possession a set of quite dense, multi-volume tome by a guy called Anderson's History of Economics. Guess whose name is written in those books? It is not Alexander Hamilton. It is Eliza Hamilton. And she read them. So she's the one sitting there saying, yeah, on page 42, Anderson says blah, blah, blah. So you can quote it. And all of a sudden, she's transformed from this doormat into a research assistant. She's the person saying, well, you can argue that because he says this. In Sumer or in Assyria, they did thus and so. So, you can talk about that. And another thing that was really very interesting is that she, to the end of her life, she tried when she was collecting Hamilton's papers to find the draft of a speech that he had given at the Constitutional Convention about the role of the president. It was a very contentious speech because Hamilton's detractors claimed that he had said that he thought America should be a monarchy. And this speech proved it. But the speech disappeared. People who had notes of it, like Madison and various other people who were at the convention, disagree about exactly what was said. And after the war and after Hamilton's death, when she was putting together his papers, she tried to find the speech itself, or even the notes that Madison had contemporaneously made of it. Madison and Jefferson and various of their friends conspired to not furnish this to her. And I was wondering, how the hell did she even know what he said? And then I found out that she had gone to the Constitutional Convention. She'd gone to Philadelphia and spent several nights with Hamilton before he gave this speech, and presumably discussed it with him, because she wasn't in the room when it happened, because outsiders weren't allowed in there. So she knew exactly what he was going to say. And it wasn't just because I don't think it was because he just said, well, I'm going to say this. She's talking to him. They're discussing it. And I suddenly, oh, right. This is why he calls her my good genius, why he, always feels like she's necessary to him. It's not just because she keeps a good house, because really any housekeeper could do that. But she is an intellectual companion, and she's a sounding board for him. She's useful. And in that way, she really contributes to what his thinking is. And I found that just fascinating. At the very last sort of speech of his life, almost, he defended the freedom of the press to the Supreme Court in Albany, the state Supreme Court. And this was a case that Eliza begged him to take. He wasn't going to take it. He actually had declined to take this case, but Eliza persuaded him to do that. And I find this fascinating, that she had a much more of an active role in his political career than anyone suspected.
Yeah, she's one of history's long list of uncredited literary and political wives. And it makes sense. I mean, anyone who's ever written anything or lives in a world of ideas, you need someone to bounce things off, right? So that's what would happen in any relationship. Things don't just happen in your brain while you're staring at the page. The conversation is required. And I love that you have this scene where she sends a copy of the Federalist to Angelica, who I think is in Paris or London at the time. And on the cover page, she writes Alexander Hamilton and Eliza Hamilton. She writes both names.
Her name is on there.
She takes ownership of that.
I love that. I love that about her. And after he died, many widows would have just sort of faded into the woodwork, but she really not only collected all of his papers and sold them to the Library of Congress so that he would not be forgotten and he would be always considered a resource to the nation that he'd helped to found, but she also pioneered to get his biography written and kept trying to find the right person, and they never panned out for one reason or another. And she ended up getting her son to write this biography, which was necessary to get the record down. And she was intent on that. She became a real activist.
It's really interesting. I find that her widowhood, I mean, she was Hamilton's widow twice as long as she ever was his wife, right? She was her widow for half a century. She also, and so Angelica died a decade after Hamilton.
Yeah, and
so she was, unfortunately, the English language does not have a word for being a bereft sibling. I think you're not a widow, you're not an orphan, but I think there should be a word for that. But she lived another 40 years after losing Angelica. Yeah. And so she's the last one of that triangle to live for decades. And it's like she comes into her own in a different way when she's no longer in either of these people's shadows. I found those finalists, at first I found them really sad and melancholy because it's like every one of her youth dies one after the other, right? There's a Lafayette who visits America.
Oh.
And like they both know it's the last time they see each other. When he gets back on the ship to France. That's heartbreaking. You know, it's like, and we know this is it.
They have such a touching little relationship too. It's very sweet.
It really is.
He comes to her with this miniature of Washington that he's screwed up because he thought, oh, there's some schmutz on Washington's face. He tries to take it off and he smears the whole thing. And then he's, oh, mon Dieu, this is bad. And she, Eliza is a fixer. She's like, oh, no, I know just the person who will fix this. Here's the restorer. We'll go here and they'll fix it. And they do. It's so sweet.
It really is. And because she lives to such an old age, nearly 100, which is in her era incredible. She's like this bridge in American history where she lives long enough. When you think about the history of American women, she lives long enough to see the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848.
Yep, she does. Alas, we don't know what, if anything, she thought of that. But one of the things that I loved was that when she gave all of Hamilton's papers to the Library of Congress, there were no restrictions placed on the papers relating to Washington's farewell address, which Hamilton had written and which the papers had been kept from her. She had to go to court to get possession of them, which is itself a whole wonderful story of a woman standing up to the establishment and saying, no, those are mine and you may not have them. But she'd done all of this. And so here are these papers that say, hey, Hamilton had an equal role in this foundational statement about what American government executive power is and what America's destiny should be. And she leaves it to the Library of Congress and anybody can see it. And Washington's heirs are furious, and they want to restrict the access, and they go to her son, John, and say, "This is an outrage, blah, blah, blah." John is such a wimp and not really a very terrific person. And he's trying to cover for his mom, and he says, "Well, this is the way that women do things." And I just think, yeah,
Actually, it is.
it
Yeah.
sure is. And she knew. I think it was that's one of her little blows struck for truth and for openness. She said, really, this is a woman who doesn't brook fabrication. She does not do it. And she's very outspoken. And I love that about her.
This was Amanda Vaill. Her Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of the Schuyler sisters, Pride and Pleasure, is available, as always, in a Broad History bookshop. There'll be a link in the show notes and at broadhistory.com, where you can also sign up for the newsletter, which is entirely free, and you can opt to support the show with a small membership or donation. This has been Broad History, and I've been your host, Isabelle Hogol. Music by Aaron Kenny. I'll talk to you next week.